Hello everyone, it's Dwayne here again from the Aurelia team. And today I want to cover probably one of my favorite fun features of Aurelia 2 and the way that you can customize it. I think it's a really good example of the power of Aurelia. When you work with Aurelia, you quickly become familiar with its powerful and expressive binding syntax. Things like .bind, .trigger, repeat for, if bind, they all become second nature if you're experienced with it. But what if you wanted to use a slightly different syntax? Maybe something that you're used to from another framework, or perhaps a custom shorthand for your own application? Well, as I said, Aurelia is so flexible. It provides quite a fascinating extensibility point called attribute patterns. So this feature allows you to teach Aurelia's template compiler how to interpret custom syntax right within your HTML templates, which I think is awesome. It's a powerful way to tailor the development experience or even emulate syntax patterns from frameworks like Angular or Vue. So what exactly is an attribute pattern? Well, we do cover this in our documentation, as you can see here, but I'm going to repeat it for you because maybe it's not clear. So at its core, an attribute pattern defines a rule for how Aurelia should parse HTML attribute name and value. So you can define a specific text pattern to look for in attribute names, and then you can provide logic to translate that pattern into Aurelia's standard binding instructions. So specifying the target property and binding command like bind, two-way, trigger, ref, etc. So defining a pattern, how do you do that? So we're going to go into our code here. We've got an Aurelia app. And I've actually got a snippet I'm going to copy and paste into our code here. And this is really how it looks. So we've got an attribute pattern decorator, we've got a pattern property, and then we've got symbols, which are symbols to ignore. We've got a class, which is how everything works. We've also got a public, your pattern here, function, and then a few other values. So this looks like a bunch of random gobbledygook to some of you, so we're going to break down the decorator's arguments. So pattern is a string defining the syntax you want to capture. It uses special keyword part in all caps, and you need to think of part as a placeholder or a capture group, like circular bracket, decimal plus in regex. It matches any sequence of characters. Your string then tells Aurelia what structure to look for using part, all in caps, and for the dynamic segments. So the symbols property here, which you can see, symbols to ignore, is a string containing characters that should be treated purely as syntax or separators within your pattern. These characters are ignored when extracting the values for the part placeholders, hence the note here of symbols to ignore. So for example, say you had a pattern of prefix, part, not party. I went to write party by default. Prefix, part, suffix, and then symbols. If we put in just a hyphen here, and the attribute value was prefix, value, suffix. So it might be like prefix, value, suffix. The part would capture value, then capture value. If symbols was empty, part would capture my value with hyphens around it, so it would actually look like this, as opposed to this in there. So hopefully that makes sense. So inside the class, you would need to define a method whose name is exactly the same string as your pattern to capture that particular change. So raw name here is the full original attribute name. So for example, that might be the banana in a box syntax of square bracket with circular bracket value inside. Raw value is the full original attribute value, for example, message. Parts is an array containing the strings captured by each part keyword in your pattern, excluding any characters listed in symbols. So the job of this method is to return an attribute syntax object. This object then tells Aurelia the real meaning of your custom syntax. So if that sounds confusing, don't worry, because we are going to be creating our own attribute pattern here very shortly. But you return a new attribute syntax value inside of here, which is this one here, and it has raw name, raw value, target, and that autocorrect and name. So target is the actual property or event name Aurelia should target. So for example, value, click, disabled, etc. Command is the standard Aurelia binding command to use, and that should be command. So for example, two-way, trigger, to-view, ref, etc. So let's make this a little bit more concrete with an example from emulating other frameworks here. So we're going to define this inside of main because we're actually going to be specifying this, registering it with Aurelia. So we're going to import a couple of important things. So attribute pattern decorator and in fact, we're not going to import it from that. We're going to import it from the runtime HTML package instead. So attribute pattern and attribute syntax from Aurelia / runtime HTML. And fix up this little error here as well. Now we're going to create a class. So class, you can do Angular two-way binding attribute pattern. So this is an example that's already in the docs, and it also is an implementation that comes shipped with Aurelia itself you can import. But to highlight how this works, we're going to define this from scratch. So what we're going to do here is we're telling it that we're looking for this banana in a box syntax as it's known in Aurelia land, Angular land. So we've got our part defined here, which says look for the value inside the banana in a box. And then for symbols, we're going to tell it to ignore those particular values. So the square brackets, circular back brackets are going to be completely ignored. Now we're going to leave a little comment here, so method name must match the pattern string, just so we don't forget. So now we're going to define our function. That's a little bit weird, I agree, but it'll make sense. So we've got our pattern here, the same. Now this is our function name, which obviously returns a string, raw value, if we can spell it correctly, string, and then parts is a string array. This function is going to return a new array attribute syntax, and we're going to leave a couple of comments in here as well. So this one's going to be the target property. So parts 0 will contain the string inside the brackets. e.g value. So target property equals parts 0. And then we're going to map this to a new attribute syntax object. So we map this syntax to Aurelia's two-way command. So return new attribute syntax. We're going to pass in the raw name. We're going to pass in the raw value, the target property, and then last but not least, the binding command, which is two-way binding. So I'm going to register this with the dependency injection container now, just so our application knows about it. And it's complaining about that attribute syntax in there. So maybe I'm just importing that from the wrong package. Of course, I think that is from the newly created template compiler package. This is the change that happened a little while ago. I just got confused there. I don't really create these attribute patterns very often. It's not something I've really ever worked with, but I do think it's a cool feature. So now that we've got this defined, we can get rid of our hello world in here, and we're going to go Angular style two-way binding. Input. Now this is where it gets really cool. So we're telling it to bind to the value property on our input. Message. And then inside of my app, we're going to create that. So make sure we have something to bind to. Hello, Angular syntax. So by default, we should have a functional component here. And you can see that it's all rendering absolutely perfect inside there. We've got our input, and then we've got our paragraph in here. It's stripped away our binding command here, which is normal. But if we go into here and we start typing, you can see that it's updating in real time because that is a two-way binding happening right there. Now, ordinarily in Aurelia, two-way binding, as you know, doesn't actually look like that. It looks like this. So if I were to get rid of this syntax here and use value.bind, this is what we're emulating. So you can see it works exactly the same way. So we're going to recap what we actually did in this particular thing because there's a few things, but it's easy to understand once you see it. So we defined the pattern with the symbols, square and circular brackets. So when the compiler sees input and then the square bracket with the circular, the banana in a box syntax as it's called, because I guess it kind of does look like a banana. It's going to see that. It sees raw name is the value, raw value is message, the binding, and then parts is value because the banana in a box symbols are being ignored. So we've got that particular part inside of our definition here. And then our method returns a new attribute syntax object telling Aurelia to target the value property with the two-way command, using message as the value expression, and voila, Angular style two-way binding. Okay, so now that we've done our Angular style two-way binding, let's do a different example using Vue's one-way binding. Now it's going to look very similar to what we did here. In fact, we are going to just pretty much reuse this. So we're going to rename this to Vue one-way binding attribute pattern. Pass that into there. Now inside of the pattern, of course, we want to use Vue syntax of colon. And then of course, as you know, we want to ignore the colon in there. And then inside of here, we're going to make that match. So we've got raw name, raw value, and parts. Inside of here, we will rename this to target attribute because that's what it is. Parts 0 will be the attribute name, e.g, disabled. Map the syntax to Aurelia's one-way, to Vue command. Or .bind would work as well, but we're going to use to Vue just to keep it proper. Now inside of this, Vue one-way binding. Then we're going to button disabled equals is saving, click.trigger equals save. Then we're going to do some conditional magic here just to show that it is working. Got our button defined here. Then we're going to create one more button to toggle the saving mode. Just do the inverse for our Boolean, toggle saving. So now that we've got that all defined, inside of myapp.ts, we're going to have default Boolean of is saving equals false. And it might be, we'll have a save method in there because we did define that, but does nothing. So now let's go into the browser and we can see we've toggled the one-way binding, but watch what happens if we do this again. You can see that it is working on this particular instance, but we have no inverse from the view to basically specify it changing. This is Aurelia's way of saying only things going into the view will change. So it's mapped to the view. So if you were to do a two-way binding here, where you try and modify that value, it is not going to work. But as you can see, that is mapped successfully. And now we're just going to go over the code real quick to show you what we did in here. So the pattern colon part with the symbol colon captures the target attribute name. And then when processing colon disabled on this particular instance up here, it's basically mapping it to disabled.toView. And then of course, like our previous examples, raw name is disabled, raw value is saving, and parts equals an array containing disabled. And then we return the attribute syntax, mapping this to what would be in Aurelia land, disabled.toView equals is saving. So far we've worked with binding values, but what if we wanted to actually map an event in our application? Say, for example, a click event. A really good example is Vue's event binding syntax, which obviously uses at event equals handler or v on event handler for event handling. We can actually do that in Aurelia too. So in here, we can actually replace this with an at. We can make the symbol at, and then of course, this at. This is going to be Vue event binding attribute pattern. So once again, part 0 will be the event name, e.g click. And we should rename this to event name because naming matters. And then inside of here, we want to map it to Aurelia's trigger command. Now, inside of our particular view here, we can go view event binding. Now we're going to create a button that has a click event. So button at click equals do something, and then do it at trigger. Now inside of our my app, we're going to have a do something method, and we're just going to do an alert for this. I did something. Let's see that code running in the browser now. We've got do it at trigger, And if we click this, it should work. I did something. So once again, to recap, it's a similar pattern to the previous ones. The at part equates to click.trigger, but the at part, we replace the at symbol. We're saying ignore that. We want part, which of course is the pattern value. Raw name is at click. Raw value would be do something, which would be the function. And the parts would be an array containing click. So we return the attribute syntax mapping this to click.trigger. So that maps to click.trigger equals do something, except we're using Vue syntax. So you can even define multiple patterns in a single class if they relate conceptually, like different variations of ref syntax could be a really good example. So now that we've created these different attribute patterns, let's talk about why use attribute patterns, because you can see they're very powerful, but why would you need them? So attribute patterns do offer significant flexibility. If you have a syntax preference, as you can see, you can use at click. If you prefer that Vue syntax, maybe you're migrating code over from existing frameworks and libraries like Vue or Angular. This can make it a lot easier. You can emulate plugin architecture. You can define your own concise syntax. So for example, the Aurelia i18n plugin uses an attribute called T for translations, and it just makes things a lot easier. You can use it for DSL creation as well. So you can build many languages specific to your application domain within attributes and kind of make it a little bit Aurelia, a bit less Aurelia, and more like how you might want to use it. So a word of caution, while powerful, overuse of radically different custom syntaxes can make your Aurelia code base less consistent and harder for new Aurelia developers to pick up. If you're getting other developers coming in and working in your code base, if you're making them learn a syntax that isn't already documented in our docs, it's going to make things difficult. But as I said, if you're using it for things like just basic emulation or migration, it is really going to make things a lot easier for you to migrate over. But I would definitely exercise caution of overusing these, but still definitely explore them and just know that they're there. So if you found this interesting, let me know if you plan on using attribute patterns or have any cool ideas for custom syntax in the comments below, or reach out on our Discord server. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and check the Aurelia docs for more on template compilation and extensibility, because you can go deeper on this stuff and it is very well extensively documented. So thank you very much for watching, and hopefully we'll see you in another video. See ya.